Dobbins was given a small grant to begin construction of warships in the protected harbor of Presque Isle Bay. With the arrival of experienced shipbuilder Noah Brown, a squadron of 6 ships, including the brigs Lawrence and Niagara, were built to challenge British control of the Great Lakes region. Skilled labor and shipbuilding materials had to be transported across long distances over treacherous terrain. But the raw materials came, as did the shipwrights, and later the officers and crews. Foremost among them, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. An ambitious young naval officer from Newport, Rhode Island, Perry arrived in Erie in March 1813. Upon taking command, he began the task of completing the ships and turning inexperienced men into battle-ready crews. Once ready, Perry sailed his squadron to Put in Bay, Ohio. There, he waited for the British squadron, which was desperately low on supplies, to emerge from their base at the western end of Lake Erie. Faced with starvation, the 6 British ships, commanded by Robert Barclay, were forced from their port into open water and Perry's guns. On the morning of September 10, 1813, Commodore Perry hoisted his "Don't Give Up the Ship" battle flag. At 11:45, the British fired the opening shots of a battle that would rage for 3 hours, the Battle of Lake Erie. Early on, Perry's flagship Lawrence sustained heavy damage. 80% of her crew were killed or wounded. In a final desperate attempt for victory, Perry transferred his command to the unharmed Niagara and swiftly broke through the enemy line. Within minutes, the thundering guns were silenced. The British surrendered. Shortly afterward, Perry inscribed his brief but legendary report.
"We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry."
Victory on Lake Erie forced the British to abandon Detroit and severed the British-Indian alliance, allowing the U.S. to regain territories lost at the start of the war. Niagara survived the war, but not the peace. In 1820, she was unceremoniously scuttled in Misery Bay at Presque Isle. It would be a century later, in March 1913, when the Perry Victory Centennial Commission raised the brig from her cold water grave and began restoration. She was then towed around the Great Lakes by the USS Wolverine and was celebrated with patriotic pageantry. In 1931, after years of neglect, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania took custody of Niagara. Restoration of the brig slowly continued through the Great Depression and World War II. Now on shore, Niagara was placed on display at the entrance to Dobbins Landing, her masts and rigging not completed until 1963. By the early 1980s, severe decay necessitated another reconstruction. Only this time, the vision of a seaworthy vessel would breathe new life into Niagara's future. Under the skilled direction of Melbourne Smith, a noted ship designer, a new U.S. brig Niagara was painstakingly built. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, she sails. Niagara and the Erie Maritime Museum are owned by by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and operated by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. A vital component of the brig's mission is keeping alive the time-honored tradition and culture of square rig sailing. Niagara is certified by the U.S. Coast Guard as a sailing school vessel and operated by a crew of 40, half professional, half trainees. They come from all walks of life, men and women, the young and the spirited. Watching Niagara sail appears effortless, but on board this wooden ship, you're in another world where a different language is spoken.
Well, Foxel, keep going, mainbrace.
And hard work is the norm. A place where teamwork is essential and following orders is the first rule.
What I find most satisfying is a slow and gradual process of seeing the crew come together, seeing green hands come to the ship and know very little, and over the course of time start learning their way around the ship, become sure-footed in the rig, become knowledgeable hands.
As summer wanes, Niagara is rigged down and wrapped in a cloak of canvas. A handful of crew work diligently through the winter to ensure many years of summer sailing. Niagara sails as a symbol of American naval history. She makes tangible the deeds of those who served in defense of our growing nation. She is a treasure of the Commonwealth and a tribute to those free spirits who keep alive the tradition of great tall ships under sail. The Great Lakes, inland seas reaching deep into the heart of North America. In the early 19th century, these waterways were the key to moving people and goods through a roadless wilderness. Erie was a small frontier village, founded in 1795, where the Presque Isle Peninsula formed the finest natural harbor on the Great Lakes. This strategic location became vitally important in the struggle to control the Northwestern Territories. The War of 1812 was a formative event for the young American nation. Britain and France were locked in the epic struggle of the Napoleonic Wars. The British interfered with American ocean-going trade, forcing some American sailors to serve in the Royal Navy. Along the western frontier, British support encouraged Native Americans to resist U.S. expansion. Many Americans saw war as the only option. After bitter debate, a sharply divided Congress declared war against the far more powerful Great Britain. While many issues that led to war were centered in the Atlantic Ocean, much of the fighting took place along the border between the U.S. and Britain. British colonies in Canada. Reaction to the U.S. declaration of war was swift. Within weeks, 3 American Great Lake forts fell to the British and their Native American allies. During these attacks, Erie's Captain Daniel Dobbins and his ship Salina were captured. Dobbins escaped and returned to Erie, where he sounded the alarm with first-hand accounts of British victories. He then took the dire news to Washington, D.C., where he persuaded President Madison to build an Upper Great Lakes squadron in Erie.
And this is where we started.
Dobbins was given a small grant to begin construction of warships in the protected harbor of Presque Isle Bay. With the arrival of experienced shipbuilder Noah Brown, a squadron of 6 ships including
We'll take a tour of the ship if you'd like to join us.
Sure.
Is what we direct most people to, especially for larger events like that.
Yeah.
As much
Either follow me.
Like so cool, Nana.
We're
Nana,
gonna
it's so cool.
take a tour of the ship right now. So if you guys want to head back, I'm going to go see if there's anyone who wants to join us here, and I'll meet you back at the corner by the model of the Niagara.
Did you guys just come off of the scallywag?
No.
No?
No, we're going to do the tour of the Great Niagara.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's how I got my start here. So I was part of the reenactment group, and I would dress up as the Powder Monkey. It was many years ago. Right, do we have everybody? Excellent.
I think
So
everybody.
I think we're still waiting for 2 people.
Yes.
Actually go over to crane and actually work.
Yes,
Yeah.
still operational. Because this building housed the generators for a coal-fired power plant that operated down here on the bayfront from 1917 up until 1991. That big giant piece of machinery right at the front there by the greeters table, that was the number 3 turbine generator unit. There were 5 of them in this building. That particular one was installed in 1927, and it operated up until they shut it down in 1991. One of the units, the oldest, is in the Smithsonian. The other 3 were sold to a country in Africa and put into service in their electrical grid. And to my knowledge, are still generating electricity for them today. So, but I just think it's a really cool building. The crane, of course, you know, if it operated or not, it would have been part of it because of the structural
The integrity of
integrity that it gives. But the pillars, the brick pillars, the brick ceramic face brick, and it's just a cool building because you don't see industrial buildings built like this anymore. I'm gonna go head up and see if the other 2 people want to join us or not. So I'll be right back.
Nana, come here.
Look at that hairstyle. There's no hair here. It's just poof all the way up. Can't wait until around Christmas time when they light up the entire boat.
Oh, is that right? The structure up there and everything?
Yeah, everything.
Okay. All right.
Sure is pretty. Isn't it interesting there's not as many seagulls here? I guess because there's lack of food here, whereas there's plenty of food up there.
That would make sense.
Yeah, there's really no place to get anything to eat over here except Dobbin's Landing. It's the only place. Also over there is the wharf, and wharf hasn't been good for the past 28 years. At least that's what I've been told. For me, it hasn't been good for like 18, 20 years.
Very knowledgeable.
In fact, there's a couple of neat pieces of it over here.
So dizzy that we're bobbing up and down.
Yeah. But after a while, you would get used to it.
That's why mommy's never gone on the ship, because she gets seasick.
She gets car sick. Seasick.
Apparently, the only boat she went on
Yes.
that she didn't get seasick on.
No. It's really remarkable the differences of the way the war is treated. Here in America, it's kind of forgotten. You get a very, you may get told that the British burned down Washington, D.C. You may hear about the Battle of New Orleans. But up in Canada, it's much more prominent because it was really the first time that the people of Canada came together, repelled a foreign invader, and it built a lot of their identity as a nation because they were colonists back then. But it was the first time because they really didn't get that much help from the regular British Army because the British, they were really busy fighting Napoleon. And Canada was kind of a backwater for them. So it was a lot of Canadian militia that really banded together and repelled the American invaders. So anyway, welcome again, everybody, to Erie Maritime Museum. My name's Brian. I'm one of the volunteer guides here. I've been involved with the ship since I was 9 years old. I started out as a reenactor, dressed up as a powder monkey. You got a fellow powder monkey here. So I did that from the time I was 9. Then by the time I was 14 years old, they had rebuilt the Niagara that we're going to go out to sea, and they had started the volunteer sailing program. So I joined on as a member of the volunteer sailing crew. I sailed on the Niagara as a volunteer the first 4 seasons that it sailed. It was a wonderful experience. I've always been a history buff. Moved away from Erie for about 15 years, but when I moved back, wanted to get back involved, so I volunteer my time as a guide, and I tell people about the ship, the War of 1812, Erie, all kinds of stuff. So, since it's fall, all of the really cool stuff, at least stuff that I find to be really cool on Niagara, unfortunately has been taken down and stored away for the winter. So I really think the best place to start our tour, especially in the wintertime, is here at this scale model. This is a scale model that was put together by our group of our volunteers, and it is an excellent model in Niagara.
What scale is it?
That's a good question. A ½ inch equals 1 foot.
Okay.
So, but the way that it's rigged, every single line on the model is in the exact spot that it would be out on the ship. It really represents the typical sail plan that Niagara would be sailing under. So you get a chance to see really Niagara in her glory at a time when, unfortunately, she's dressed down and buttoned up for winter. Just a couple of quick vital statistics about Niagara. Niagara's length on deck is 110 feet. Her spar length, which is the length from the tip of the jib boom all the way to the end of the spanker boom, that's 198 feet. Her maximum beam, which is her maximum width, is 32 feet. Her foremast, which is the mast at the front, it measures 113 feet from the water line. It's in 3 sections. When we get out there, you'll see that most of the sections have been taken down. The main mast is 118 feet from the water line. Now, Niagara is a square rigger. Does anybody know what a square rigger is? All right, a square rigger is a sailing ship that carries square sails. Now, the square sails are the sails that are hanging off of the horizontal spars that are in front of the main mast and the foremast here. Those spars, called yards, they can be rotated to port and starboard on the horizontal plane. And the reason they need to be rotated is because of the nature of square rig sailing. The ship has to position itself in order to go forward, has to position herself in a way that the wind is either coming off of the port side or the starboard side, so they have to rotate those yards so the sails can catch the wind. Now those yards can be rotated and set 90 degrees or square to the center line of the ship running fore and aft. And that's where you get the name square sail, and that's where you get square rigger. Now, Niagara also carries fore and aft sails. The fore and aft sails are all kind of oriented along the center line of the ship, and that's the triangular head sails, the stay sails, which are between the masts, and then that big sail at the aft there that's called the spanker. Niagara is specifically a brig. A brig is a 2-masted sailing ship that has square sails on her foremast and her main mast. And there are a bunch of different configurations of sailing ships and how they're rigged, and they all have different names. There's full rig ships, there's barks, there's barkentines, there's brigs, there's brigantines, there's ketches, there's schooners, there's sloops, topsail schooners, on and on and on. Just depending on what the ship did, where it sailed, how it sailed, they would configure the sails in different ways. So,
and all those ships are named after the size that they were, right?
Not necessarily. Really has more to do with the way they're rigged. For example, at the end of the summer, we had a Tall Ships Festival, and we had a brigantine came in, and a brigantine is a 2-masted ship that has square sails on the foremast, but on her main mast is just fore and aft sails. And that brigantine was only about 60 feet long on deck. So even though she was a small vessel, she was rigged as a brigantine. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the actual size of the ship. One last thing I'm going to mention before we go outside. Niagara carries 2 types of rigging. She has standing rigging, and the standing rigging is the black rigging. Runs from fore to aft, and then also from side to side. Now that rigging supports the masts. Without standing rigging, Niagara's sails would catch wind, and they would just fall right over. The mast would fall right over, and you wouldn't get anywhere. Probably a bunch of people would get hurt, and it wouldn't be any good to run a ship that way. So standing rigging is integral to the ship, making sure that those masts, which are really the ship's engines, making sure that they're upright and catching wind and making the ship go.
What is the rigging? Point it out. I don't understand.
Oh, sorry, it's the
that.
black rigging.
Okay, got it.
And then also the black rigging that runs from fore to aft.
Have you seen the Errol Flynn movies? It's the ones that they climb up on.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yes,
you
okay,
see
very-
the
yeah.
shrouds, which is the standing rigging that comes from each side. It has little rope ladders. Those lines are called ratlins. And that is used to make a ladder because the crew does have to go up into the rig to work aloft. And so they use that as a ladder to get aloft. The other type of rigging is the running rigging. The running rigging is the brown colored rigging. Now that rigging operates and controls all of the sails and all of the spars. It's really what makes the ship go. And if you took every line of running rigging on Niagara and you laid it end to end, it would be over 6 feet long, or 6 miles long.
Wow.
6 feet long wouldn't be that. There's over 100 different lines that control all the sails and the spars on Niagara. And it really is, it's what makes the ship go. So before we go outside, just a couple of safety notes. Please watch your step going through the doorways. Also going down the stairway onto the plaza. Also be careful navigating the gangway and coming down the stairs on board deck. Once we are on deck, Niagara is a working ship. Everything should be kind of cleaned up, but there are some tripping hazards, so just be aware of what is down at your feet.
Tell me, the crew, how many people would have been on that ship
In
wartime?
In 1813, her crew was 155 men. Now, only a small percentage of those men were actually sailors and in charge of operating the ship. The overwhelming majority of those crew members were gunners. They were in charge of operating the cannons. Niagara and Lawrence carried 20 cannons, and each one of those cannons needed a crew of 7 men and a boy in order to...
What did the boy do?
The boy was a powder monkey, and his job was to run from his cannon down below deck to the powder magazine, get a powder charge, run it back up to his cannon, and his job was to just do that over and over during the battle to make sure that his cannon always had charges available to be loaded, so the cannons could be fired.
Do you know Maxine Gould?
I think I've met her.
She volunteers for that.
Yes, yeah. I think I have met her.
Yeah, very short little old lady.
Yes.
Okay.
So please follow me.
Are you up for this, Bob?
No.
No? Okay. I think we'll just pass.
Okay.
We'll look over here.
Now, did they have any accounts of any what was
Thank you.
monkey?
Powder monkeys?
Powder monkeys ever getting hurt? And
Yes.
I'm sure they did. That's
Yes.
logical. I'm sure
Powder
it's going up
monkeys
the old
were
gun.
casualties, as well as along with other members of the crew. Sometimes powder monkey would get in the way of a recoiling cannon and get crushed by that. Also would get hit either by shot itself or the splinters that the shots caused. Yes, they were paid. They were paid members of the crew.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
now, what's the key difference between a powder monkey and a cabin boy?
Well, pretty much.
Besides the fact that the powder monkey just went up to the cannons?
On a warship, the powder monkeys probably would have did double duty.
Okay.
When they weren't in combat or gun drilling, they would have attended to the officers and the captain.
Okay.
This is where they did gymnastics.
Whoops.
Yeah, here.
As you can see on the foremast, they've already taken down the top two sections. They're going to keep just the two sections of the main mast up. They just took down the topgallant mast.
Can't see anything. Because the big stuff.
Well, they, weather in northern house too during the winter when it's not sailing.
And also during Christmas time, they light it up with Christmas
Oh,
lights.
how beautiful. You live here in Erie?
Yeah. I've lived here all my life.
I'm from Pittsburgh.
Oh,
I'm from Philadelphia.
Oh,
They're from
Philadelphia.
Pittsburgh, too.
Philadelphia, wow. I've been in there only to the airport, and I was not having a fun time there.
All I know is that it's 6 something.
We'll head back aft.
That's what they used to lift the anchor.
Yeah, that's right.
Tripping hazard right there, be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of the crew had a day off today. They were really busy last weekend putting up the cover and the roof. That's a cleat. That is used to, there are lines that will come down and be made fast to this cleat, and this cleat, and this cleat, and this cleat. So,
Another cleats.
yep. Because there are lines that come down right down along the mast, and this is the best place to make them fast. And typically, the bigger the cleat, the heavier the thing the line is connected to. So.
There are two cannons.
Two cannons, and each one of these large openings houses the cannons.
Yeah, and Niagara only carries two nowadays. Back during the Battle of Lake Erie, she had 20. So, and I'll talk about those as we head back up here in just a couple of minutes. All right, so just a couple of terms of orientation. We are heading towards the back of the ship. The back of the ship is called the stern. So when you are heading back towards the stern, you're moving aft. Ahead of us is the front of the ship. That is called the bow. When we are moving towards the bow, we're moving forward. I am facing the bow. The left-hand side is port. The right-hand side is starboard. And that stays the same regardless of which way you're pointing. That's always going to be port. That's always going to be starboard. So back here towards the stern of the ship, things that I like to point out when I take a group out is this piece of machinery right here. This is called the capstan. It's a big human-powered winch, because all Niagara really is a big human-powered machine whose fuel is the wind. So pretty much all of the lifting is done just using human strength plus some mechanical advantage. And this piece of equipment, the capstan here, is a mechanical advantage. If you look on each side to the aft of us here, you see bars that are stowed. Those are the capstan bars. They fit into the round or the square pegs here, or the square holes here, and they stick out long enough that one or two crew members can stand at the end of it, and they can walk a complete circle, clearing corners of the deck boxes and the deck houses here. They use that for the heaviest lifting. When she's underway sailing, that'll be used daily to raise the anchor. Also, they use that when they de-rig her in the fall to lower down these spars and the upper parts of the masts. And then in the springtime, they will use that to raise those components back up into the rig to get her ready to sail in the summertime. You had a question?
There's something that flashed
That flashed?
while you were talking.
Oh, okay. It may have been this. There are about 6 of these
But it was
glass.
there.
My camera.
Oh.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's all right.
But the other thing I'd like to point out here is down here in these glass pieces that are embedded in the deck. So I said I believe there's about 6 on each side. What those are called they're called deck lights. Now, most likely the original Niagara and Lawrence didn't have these. However, they are a contemporary technology to 1813. So the designers in 1988 decided to include these features in the ship. And what the deck light does, it is a way to illuminate below decks during sunlight or during daytime without using any candles or electric light. It's a glass prism. The sunshine or the light shines through the top of it and it gets distributed out through the prism. And on a bright sunny day, it can get as bright as a 120 watt light bulb. So
Wow.
it's a pretty neat feature. It had been used in ships, for hundreds of years. And like I said, it's something that they decided to include in this reconstruction, even though most likely it wouldn't have been included in the original. So we're going to head a little farther back here. Kind of watch out for this light here. We'll come over to this side.
So there are like total of 12 on the deck.
I believe so. Yes.
Are you gonna go downstairs?
Yes, we will. All right, so when I'm standing by here, this is Niagara's helm. Niagara does not have a ship's wheel. She's steered using a tiller. The fact that she is steered nowadays with a tiller is a result of some educated guessing amongst the designers of the latest reconstruction. Back in 1813, the ships of Perry's fleet, including Lawrence and Niagara, they had to be built quickly, they had to be built simply, they had to be built well enough to either defeat the British in battle, or if the British defeated them in battle, the British would want to keep them as prizes of war. And the only locally sourced material that they had for the building of the fleet in 1813 was the wood. Everything else that went on the ships, the sails, the rope, all of the iron, all of that had to be brought in overland. And back in 1813, that was a pretty tall order. There were highways, but they really were nothing more than trails in the woods. So it was a really big logistical feat to pull off the building of the fleet here. So the designers in 1988, they figured that most likely they would not have ordered a wheel in or had taken the time to craft an actual ship's wheel when they were building the fleet, and they would have just taken a hunk off of a tree and whittled it down into a tiller, stuck it into the rudder post, bam, you have a helm. Now most of the time the helm is set amidships, and when you stand at the helm and you look forward, you can't see what's in front of you. But that's not really the responsibility of the helmsman. The helmsmen are not steering by sight. They're steering either by looking up into the rig and watching how the wind fills the sails and making their adjustments to make sure that the sails are as full of wind as they can be, or they are steering to a particular compass point. And the compass here is housed in the middle of this cabinet. It's called a binnacle. Binnacle is a 3-part cabinet. The compass would be in the center. and they would have areas here on each side. The partitions in the middle would be made of glass, and on each side, when the ship was sailing after dark, they would put a lantern or candles in there, and that way they would illuminate the compass without compromising anyone else's night vision. So nowadays, we keep our radar readouts and some modern navigational instruments on this side, and our engine throttles here on this side, because Niagara does have two diesel engines that are her auxiliary power, because she often has timetables that she needs to fulfill, and the wind doesn't always cooperate. So, does anybody have any questions? All right, well, we will head forward here on the starboard side, and we'll stop up there at the cannon. Stop here at the cannon.
There's the smell of the wood.
This is cool. Did they put anything through here?
Yeah.
That's
this
where
is
they put
actually-
that's where they put the wax rope so that they could.
That's where, yes, the fuse, more or less. And then this piece is made of lead, and it's used to cover up the hole when not in use. That way,
Sounds like plastic.
Well, it would originally be made out of lead.
yeah, well, this one is made out of lead. But lead is,
Lead is very,
malleable.
yeah, you can bend it really easily.
nobody saw that.
It sounds like plastic. I did see what happened.
Don't tell anybody.
I
If
definitely
anybody says
watched
anything, I'm
what
gonna say,
happened.
she did it. She did it. It wasn't me. I'm a trained guide. I would never do anything like that, so.
You never know what children will
That's
get up
right.
to.
They're-
I never fixed it.
I wouldn't really.
Don't go over there.
All right, so Niagara is a warship still, and she is armed. This is one of Niagara's two cannons. The other one is on the port side there. The weight of these cannon are factored into the ballast, so we have one on each side at the same spot of the ship for balance. These are modern cannons. They are capable of firing actual cannonballs.
Can snow get through those?
A little bit.
As long as it doesn't get wrecked.
Yes. No, it minimizes the amount of snow and rain and stuff that gets down onto the deck. But this is an all-weather ship, so even if a little bit gets on, remember this is sailing around in the lake, rain or shine, so the deck and all this stuff can stand up to the weather. But because the weather is so fierce in the wintertime, we want to protect it as much as we can and keep it as dry and as clean as we can. But if a little bit of rain or snow gets in here, it's not going to hurt anything. So these cannons have been used to fire real live cannonballs. In
I've
fact,
actually seen it fire stuff
Yeah.
at the end of the summer.
yep.
That was really startling. At tall ships.
Yes. So it's only really fires blanks now. We don't fire actual cannonballs out of this anymore. But every time that Niagara goes out on a day sail, the crew goes through a gun drill and fires a blank charge to give our guests that are our day sail trainees that are on board that day sail, to give them an idea of how loud and how much smoke these cannon can fire. And it's pretty impressive. Sometimes they will position the ship so when they fire the blank, all the smoke that goes out of the barrel gets caught by the wind and gets blown back across the deck. And for about 5 seconds, that smoke is so thick that you cannot see the other side of the ship. So, using a little bit of imagination, you can multiply the sound of that cannon by 20. You can multiply the smoke by about 20 and kind of give yourself a little idea of just how awful the atmosphere on deck would have been during the battle. Does anybody have any questions about the cannon?
What was the weight of the charge?
This particular cannon would have fired a 32-pound cannonball.
That's heavy.
Yes. And there were two types of cannon on board Niagara. There were these types of cannons which fired the 32-pound cannonballs. And then all the way at the first gun port, they would have had what was called a 12-pound long gun that would fire a 12-pound shot. The long gun was a long-range weapon, had an effective range about 1,000 yards. This cannon was more powerful, but it was a short-range cannon.
Because the cannonball was heavy, and so gravity would take it down.
Not necessarily. It really had to do with the way that this cannon was designed. It was a lightweight cannon, but it was powerful. But of course, the drawback was the range. So this was actually really good at about 200 yards was its sweet spot. Beyond that, it kind of lost power and.
There's no fire twisted inside. It's all smooth bore.
No, smooth bore. They hadn't started using rifling yet.
I forgot my
Okay, well, if you think about it, let me know.
How far back would these cannons blow back with the shot?
Pretty much to where it is right now. This is brought all the way back in, and so once when they started the battle, of course, they would have had to use a rope or a block and tackle to pull the gun back in to load it. But once it started firing, the recoil of the cannon would bring it back each time, and this big rope here at
Would
the
stop
end,
it from going any
yes,
further.
it's called the breech rope, which was designed to arrest the recoil. Did you remember?
Does it rock forward or no?
Not really. However,
Because I've seen a lot of movies that they make the cannon rock forward and rock back.
well, if it was very rough, there's a possibility that the cannon would roll back and forth, but they were very careful to secure the cannon when they were underway because they didn't want it rolling back and forth.
So that nobody could get hit.
Exactly, because have you heard the term loose cannon? Well, anyway.
A loose cannon cop.
Yeah, that's loose cannon is a police officer who plays by his own rules, but he gets results. But the commissioner's always on his case. But anyway,
lots of people get hurt when he.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
But that term came from naval warfare because if you had a loose cannon rolling around on deck, a lot of people would get hurt, and it was not a good thing to have. So.
Is the rope all made of hemp?
Yeah, I believe so.
At
I
the
believe
time,
this is
yes.
natural.
That's natural. Okay.
Yeah, I believe this is natural. But there is some Dacron and polyester lines that are used in the rigging. That's another rope that is used to just secure the ship. They really lash it down to make sure that it's not moving or that it's not going to move when it's moving. You want to follow me up forward here?
Oops, somebody left their coffee. Somebody left their coffee on the little stand there. It's pretty funny.
Oh my goodness.
I'm not hot. That's the bell that they use to ring.
Yep, that is the ship's bell. And that bell is a replica of the bell of the Queen Charlotte. The Queen Charlotte was one of the British ships that was captured at the end of the Battle of Lake Erie. Now, Niagara, there is no record of what type of bell she had before the battle. Some people would say she didn't have a bell, but I tend to think that she had to have something to chime out the time. That was how the whole crew knew what time it was, how much time they had left in their watch, if they were on watch or off watch, because only the officers would actually have timepieces. And one of the officers would be responsible for ringing out the time for the rest of the crew. And they would do that by chiming on the bell. So Niagara must have had something to tell time, but we do know for a fact that after the battle was over, they took the bell from the Queen Charlotte, and they put it in Niagara's belfry, and they kept it on Niagara until they scuttled her in 1825.
Is there something warm in here?
Yeah, that's a heater.
Yeah.
That's why you're warm.
It's just coming down.
So as I mentioned, that this is a replica of Queen Charlotte's bell. The original is in the museum. After Niagara was sunk, they put it in the belfry of City Hall, and it rang out the fire brigade until it cracked, as happens to bells. But in the early 90s, when they rebuilt Niagara, one of the local funeral directors, whose hobby is metal casting, he sandcasted that replica and gave it to the ship, and it's been in the belfry ever since.
Why is this rope black?
This is a piece of the standing rigging. This is one of the stays. And like I said, this is one of the pieces of rigging that supports the mast, running from fore to aft. The other thing I'd like to point out here in the bow is this hatchway here. This is the galley hatchway. So right below us is the ship's galley.
Kitchen.
That's the kitchen, exactly. And the reason why it's remarkable to me is that they have described the Battle of Lake Erie as the day the hungry came out to fight the sick. Now, the hungry were the British. As soon as the American fleet got out in Lake Erie and was sailing around, that cut the British supply line. The way they got supplies from their base at the western end of the lake was they sailed all the way to the eastern end of the lake, hooked up with their buddies, loaded up their ships, and sailed back to their base to the western end of the lake. But once Perry's fleet was out there, they couldn't do that anymore. So they were starving. They had been on half rations for weeks, and on the day of the battle, September 10th, 1813, they only had about 2 days' worth of half rations left. So they were the hungry.
What does that mean?
Like rations.
Rations.
They rationed out their food, or they had.
Yeah, it would be the size of the meal.
Yeah.
So usually, say you know, if you sat down every day, you ate a hamburger and French fries. If you were on half rations, you would only get half of the hamburger
and half of the fries.
The normal French fries that you would get. It's a way to stretch out the supply of food.
So you don't eat all of it in the first 10 days.
Yeah. So they were starving. They were about to run out of food. Now the Americans were the sick. As soon as the American fleet got out on Lake Erie, over a third of the complement of the fleet were sick with something called lake fever. And now lake fever was a really gross, nasty illness. It was fever, chills, aches, vomiting, and diarrhea. And a lot of the people that had that lake fever were so sick that they could not even be on board the ship to fulfill their duty. Now, part of the reason why they think lake fever was so rampant in the American fleet was due to the fact that this hatchway, the galley hatchway, was located forward on all of the ships. Now, the Lake Erie fleet was operating on a body of fresh water. So unlike ocean-going naval ships and merchant ships, they didn't have to carry their own supply of fresh water. They could just get it over the side, which they did. So the galley mates, they would come hopping up this hatchway here, throw a bucket over the side on a rope, get a bucket full of water, take it downstairs for drinking, for cooking, for washing their hands, for all of that. So in theory, it's a pretty good idea. But in practice, there was another part of the ship that was all the way forward. That was a very important part of the ship and was connected to the galley in a way. Another name for the bow of the ship is the head of the ship. And a name for the toilet on the ship is the heads, because typically they were always at the bow. And they would have been nestled down there next to the bowsprit, and they would have been nothing more than a bench with some holes in it, and any business that was transacted would just fall right into the lake. Of course, they did not really know how diseases were communicable between other humans. So these poor galley mates unknowingly were coming up and they were throwing their buckets in the water and they were pulling their drinking water from the sewer. And so that's why they think everybody was so sick. And it is a gross story, but I like to tell it.
And is that also why the poop deck becomes something
No,
similar?
the poop deck, and I've read it a couple times. I believe it has to do with a translation from, I think it's either French or Portuguese.
Okay.
And I forget exactly the details, but that's where I think that's where poop deck came from. I don't think it had anything to do with bodily functions. So, does anybody have any questions?
What about the ship's bell?
Huh?
What about the ship's bell?
Oh, that is the replica of Queen Charlotte's bell, and after the battle, they took the bell from Queen Charlotte, which was one of the British ships, and they gave it to Niagara, and that was Niagara's bell until they sank her in 1825.
Yeah, they get moved around like that.
Yeah. So
Do you know which funeral director it was?
I don't remember which one it was. All right, so we're gonna head below decks. It is kind of a tight space, so if you guys are.
I'll wait for you up here.
Yeah.
I think I answered. Thank God I asked that question.
All right. The little. Oh, those are the pin rails. That is where there would be belaying pins in all of those, and that's where they would make fast the rigging.
Someone is, my Nana isn't coming to the
Okay. Okay, that's fine. She can stay up here on deck. So.
Okay.
So just note, there's very low headroom down below deck, so watch your head. It's only about 5 feet.
You can start.
Yeah.
You can't stay down here. Come up.
My dad would have a problem walking.
Going down the steep stairs.
We went steeper like 2 hours ago.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they took all of those sea bags down, most of the sea bags down, and put them away for the winter already.
So that the sailors could then again put all their stuff.
Yep, the sea bags really
The
kept all
number
their
one
stuff.
thing that my brother would first pack was Arfie and Blanky. It's a pet stuffed dog and blanket.
Yeah, hey. I had a blankie for the longest time. Don't know what happened to it.
Don't break it.
Give me in the head.
And, whoa. There are hammocks still up.
Yep. Where the cabin people would sleep and officers.
We'll head back and we'll see the officers' area as well. So down here, this is the berth deck of Niagara. This is where, back in 1813, this is where the enlisted men would sleep. Nowadays, this is where our sail trainees and the lowest ranking members of the professional crew sleep. As you can see, there's no bunks because just like back in 1813, nowadays our crew sleeps in hammocks. And if you look behind you in the sail bin, we have a couple hammocks strung up.
And a couple on the other side.
That's right. So if you are, one of our seaman apprentices and ordinary seamen, most likely you would have a hammock here, and this is where you would sleep. Like I said, all of our sail trainees, when they come on board, they are issued a hammock, and they are also issued a sea bag. Sea bag, of course, is where they keep all of their
Stuff.
either stuff that they bring with them, changes of clothes, blankies, dogs, toothbrush, whatever. And it would be pretty much the same as back in 1813 when people volunteered to become part of the fleet, and they joined the ship. They were given a hammock, and they were given a sea bag. Of course, in their sea bag, they got a brand new set of clothes. They got their uniform, and that was also where they got to keep whatever they brought along with them. This is also where the crew eats. Some of you guys are sitting on boxes here. Those boxes are mess boxes. And nowadays, Niagara's crew is broken up into 3 watches. And then each of those watches is broken up into 2 divisions. So we have 6 total divisions, and each division is its own mess. You eat with your division, and so you keep all of your silverware, glasses, plates, bowls, condiments in your mess box. And there are 6 sets of tables and benches. You guys are sitting on the benches. Benches either, have 2 sides, or they hook into the slats of the sail bin. And the tables are the other end is suspended by a rope that gets hooked up here into this eyelet. There's eyelet over around the other side here. So
that they don't slide around.
yes, exactly.
And then you go like this so that your plate doesn't go everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.